They had been told it was all propaganda. For years, German soldiers and officers had heard stories about American industry, stories so exaggerated they were easy to dismiss. Endless factories, unlimited machines, aircraft produced faster than they could be destroyed. To many in Germany, these claims sounded like psychological warfare designed to intimidate rather than inform. So when a group of captured German prisoners of war were taken on a supervised visit to one of America's most famous factories, they expected to see something impressive, but not impossible. What they encountered instead was something they had never imagined. The facility was called Willow Run Plant, a massive industrial complex built specifically to produce one aircraft, the B-24 Liberator. Located outside Detroit, it stretched across the landscape on a scale that defied conventional understanding of manufacturing. Even before stepping inside, the sheer size of the plant began to challenge their assumptions. From a distance, it looked less like a factory and more like a city. Endless rooftops, smokestacks, rail lines, and service roads stretching to the horizon. Trucks moved in constant motion. Trains delivered raw materials in a steady stream. Everything about the place suggested motion, coordination, and purpose. The German prisoners had seen factories before. Germany itself had a powerful industrial base. But what they were looking at here was something fundamentally different. Not just larger, but organized in a way that felt almost mechanical in its precision. As they entered the building, the scale became even more overwhelming. The interior was vast, so large that parts of the assembly line disappeared into the distance, vanishing behind structural supports and layers of machinery. Overhead, cranes moved components through the air with careful synchronized timing. Below, thousands of workers moved with rhythm and efficiency, each focused on a specific task. There was no chaos, no shouting, no visible confusion. Instead, there was a steady, almost hypnotic flow. The prisoners watched as sections of aircraft moved past them, not finished bombers, but pieces in progress. A fuselage here, a wing structure there, wiring harnesses being installed, rivets driven into place with rapid, precise bursts. Every worker seemed to know exactly what to do and exactly when to do it. What stood out most was not just the number of workers, but who they were. Many were women, something the German observers did not expect on this scale. In the United States, with millions of men deployed overseas, women had taken on industrial roles in unprecedented numbers. They operated machinery, assembled components, and worked on the line with confidence and speed. To the German officers, this alone was a revelation. In Germany, the integration of women into heavy industrial production had been more limited and often less efficient. Here, it was seamless. The workforce itself had become part of the production machine. And then there was the movement of the line. The prisoners began to notice that nothing stayed still for long. The aircraft sections were not being built in one place. They were moving, slowly, continuously, almost imperceptibly at first. Each station added something, completed a task, and then the structure moved on. This was not traditional manufacturing. This was closer to what Henry Ford had pioneered decades earlier, the moving assembly line. But now, instead of automobiles, it was being used to construct one of the most complex machines of the war, a B-24 bomber. The idea itself seemed improbable. Aircraft had always been treated as precision instruments, built carefully, often slowly, by skilled specialists. Yet here they were being assembled in stages, at scale, with a system designed for speed. The prisoners exchanged glances. Some began to understand what they were seeing. Others struggled to process it. As they moved further along the line, the pieces began to look more complete. Wings were attached,
tail sections aligned, engines mounted. The aircraft took shape step by step, transformation happening in front of their eyes. And still the line kept moving. There was no pause for admiration, no moment where the process stopped to reflect on what had been built. The system did not care about the individual aircraft, it cared about the flow. Efficiency over individuality, output over perfection. For men who came from a system that often emphasized craftsmanship and precision, this approach felt almost alien. Yet it was impossible to ignore its effectiveness. Everywhere they looked, there were signs of coordination on a massive scale. Supplies arrived exactly when needed. Workers rotated through tasks without disrupting the flow. Supervisors monitored progress but rarely intervened. The system seemed to regulate itself. One officer later described the experience as watching a machine that built machines. And perhaps most unsettling of all was the realization that this was just one factory. The United States had dozens of major production centers, each contributing to the war effort in different ways: ships, tanks, vehicles, munitions, and aircraft. What they were witnessing at Willow Run was not an exception. It was part of a larger pattern. A system designed not just to produce weapons, but to outproduce any opponent. As the tour continued, the prisoners became quieter. The skepticism they had carried with them began to fade, replaced with something more difficult to admit. The stories they had dismissed as propaganda were, if anything, understated. This was real, and it forced a question none of them could easily answer. If this level of production could be sustained, if bombers could be built continuously in such numbers, what did that mean for the future of the war? No one said it out loud, but the thought was there, hanging in the air, as constant and unavoidable as the movement of the assembly line.
At the beginning, even in America, many believed it couldn't be done. Building cars was one thing. Building heavy bombers, complex machines made of thousands of precision parts, was something entirely different. Aircraft production had always been slow, methodical, and dependent on skilled labor. It was not supposed to be fast. It was not supposed to be simple. And yet, that was exactly what one man intended to change. Henry Ford had already transformed the world once by perfecting the moving assembly line for automobiles. His factories could produce cars at a scale and speed no competitor could match. To him, efficiency was not just a goal, it was a philosophy. So when the United States began preparing for war, Ford saw an opportunity to apply that same philosophy to something far more ambitious: aircraft. The idea sounded unrealistic even to experienced engineers. A bomber like the B-24 Liberator was not a simple machine. It required complex wiring systems, precision-engineered engines, reinforced structures, and countless components that had to fit together perfectly. Unlike cars, aircraft could not tolerate small errors. Even minor defects could lead to catastrophic failure. But Ford believed the problem was not the aircraft, it was the process. Traditional aircraft manufacturing relied heavily on skilled craftsmen working in small teams, often building large sections by hand. This approach ensured quality, but it limited speed. Ford's vision was to break that process apart, divide it into smaller, repeatable tasks, and organize everything into a continuous flow. In other words, he wanted to treat bombers like cars. To make this vision a reality, the Ford Motor Company took on one of the most ambitious industrial projects in history: the creation of the Willow Run production system. The goal was not just to build aircraft, but to reinvent how they were built. At first, the challenges were overwhelming. Aircraft designs were constantly changing as engineers improved performance and responded to battlefield needs. This made standardization difficult. Suppliers struggled to keep up with the demand for parts.
Workers, who many had never seen the inside of an aircraft before, needed to be trained quickly and efficiently. Early production attempts were slow and often chaotic. There were bottlenecks, misaligned components, delays in delivery, sections that didn't fit together the way they were supposed to. For a time, it seemed like the critics had been right. Maybe aircraft simply could not be mass-produced in the same way as automobiles. But the system evolved. Engineers and managers began refining the process, breaking it down further, simplifying tasks, and introducing new tools and techniques. Parts were standardized wherever possible. Jigs and fixtures ensured that components were assembled with consistent precision. Training programs turned inexperienced workers into effective specialists in a matter of weeks. The factory itself became a kind of living experiment, constantly adjusting, improving, and adapting. One of the most important breakthroughs was the full integration of the moving assembly line. Instead of building aircraft in fixed positions, the production process was reorganized so that the aircraft itself moved from station to station. Each team performed a specific task, and then the aircraft advanced to the next stage. This reduced delays, it minimized confusion, and most importantly, it created a predictable rhythm. Step by step, the impossible began to take shape. The speed increased, the errors decreased, coordination improved. What had once seemed chaotic started to resemble something far more controlled, almost elegant in its efficiency. The factory was no longer struggling to build aircraft, it was learning how to build them faster, better, and in greater numbers. And as the system stabilized, the results became impossible to ignore. Production numbers began to climb. What had started as a bold experiment was turning into a functioning machine, one capable of delivering heavy bombers at a pace that challenged every assumption about manufacturing limits. For the prisoners walking through Willow Run, this part of the story was invisible in the moment. They were seeing the finished system, not the struggle that had created it. But that struggle mattered, because it revealed something deeper about American industry during the war. It was not just powerful, it was adaptable. When faced with a problem, it did not accept limitations, it redefined them. The idea that aircraft could not be mass-produced had been treated as a fact. Ford treated it as a challenge, and by the time the system reached maturity, the factory was no longer trying to prove a point. It was simply producing, relentlessly, efficiently, and at a scale that would soon reshape the air war itself. What the prisoners were witnessing was not just a factory, it was the result of a radical idea, pushed through failure, refined through persistence, and ultimately turned into reality. An idea that, once proven, could not be undone.
By the time the system reached full capacity, what had once seemed impossible became routine. There was no dramatic moment when everything suddenly worked, no single breakthrough that changed everything overnight. Instead, the transformation happened gradually, small improvements, repeated thousands of times until the entire process became something new. Something faster, something relentless. Inside Willow Run plant, the production line no longer struggled. It moved with confidence, with rhythm, with precision that came not from perfection, but from repetition. And at the center of it all was a number that seemed almost unreal. 1 bomber every 63 minutes. For the German prisoners watching the process unfold, this was the moment when disbelief truly began to collapse. It wasn't just the size of the factory or the number of workers, it was the speed. The idea that a heavy bomber could be completed in just over an hour challenged everything they thought they understood about industrial limits. But the reality was even more impressive than the number suggested. No single aircraft was built in 63 minutes from start to finish. Instead, dozens of bombers were being assembled simultaneously along a continuous line. Each one moved forward step by step, passing through carefully organized stations where specific tasks were completed. At any given moment, multiple aircraft were in different stages of construction.
and every 63 minutes, one of them rolled off the line. The system depended on timing. Each station had a defined role. Workers did not build entire sections, they performed focused, repeatable actions, installing wiring, securing panels, mounting components, driving rivets with rapid, practiced precision. The work was broken down so completely that even with minimal experience could contribute effectively after training. The result was consistency. Not flawless craftsmanship in the traditional sense, but a level of uniformity that made large-scale production possible. Errors were reduced not by slowing down, but by designing the system so that mistakes were harder to make in the first place. Above the line, cranes carried massive components into position: wings, fuselage sections, tail assemblies. Below, teams moved in coordination, each step flowing into the next. There was no need for urgency in the traditional sense. No one rushed, because the line itself never stopped. This was the key difference. In many factories, delays could ripple outward, slowing everything down. At Willow Run, the system was designed to absorb disruption. If a problem occurred, it was addressed without halting the entire process. Adjustments were made in real time, keeping the flow intact. To the observers, it felt less like watching people build aircraft and more like watching a machine operate, except the machine was made of thousands of human beings, each playing a role within a larger structure. And then there were the aircraft themselves. The B-24 Liberator was not a simple design. It had a long, slender fuselage, a distinctive high-mounted wing, and 4 powerful engines. It required extensive wiring, fuel systems, navigation equipment, and defensive armament. Every part had to be installed correctly. Every connection had to function under extreme conditions. Yet here it was, moving steadily through the line, growing more complete with each passing station. What began as a collection of parts slowly transformed into a fully formed bomber ready for testing and deployment. The prisoners watched as one aircraft neared completion. Final checks were performed, panels secured, systems reviewed, and then, almost without ceremony, it moved forward, out of the main assembly area, making way for the next aircraft behind it. There was no pause, no sense of finality, because another bomber was already taking its place. This continuous output was what made the system so powerful. It wasn't just about building aircraft, it was about building them faster than they could be destroyed, faster than an enemy could replace their own losses. For Germany, aircraft production had always been constrained by resources, by bombing raids, by the limits of decentralized manufacturing. Factories were often smaller, more specialized, and more vulnerable to disruption. What the prisoners were seeing here was the opposite: centralized, scaled, protected, a system designed not just to produce, but to endure. And as they stood there, watching bomber after bomber take shape, a deeper realization began to form. This was not just an industrial achievement, it was a strategic weapon. Every aircraft leaving the line represented more than firepower. It represented capacity, the ability to sustain pressure over time, to replace losses without slowing down, to increase output when needed rather than reduce it. The number, 63 minutes, was not just a statistic, it was a statement. It said that this system could continue, hour after hour, day after day, producing the tools of war with a consistency that few nations could hope to match. For the German officers, many of whom had believed that American production claims were exaggerated, this was the moment when doubt gave way to something else: recognition. Not admiration exactly, but understanding. They were no longer looking at a factory, they were looking at a capability, one that extended far beyond the walls of Willow Run and far beyond the moment they were witnessing. Because if one plant could do this, what could the rest of American industry achieve?
What the prisoners had seen inside the factory was impressive. What it meant beyond the factory was far more unsettling. Because Willow Run plant was not an isolated miracle, it was part of a much larger system, an entire nation organized for production on a scale that no other country in the war could truly match. To understand why, you have to look at the differences in how the war economies were built. Germany entered the war with a strong industrial base, but it was structured differently. Production was often decentralized, spread across multiple facilities, many of them smaller and specialized. This allowed for flexibility, but it also created vulnerabilities. Coordination was more difficult. Standardization was harder to achieve. And when Allied bombing campaigns intensified, those scattered factories became targets. Disruption became constant. Rail lines were hit, power supplies interrupted, skilled workers lost or displaced. Even when factories remained intact, their ability to function efficiently was steadily reduced. Production slowed not because Germany lacked engineers or knowledge, but because the system itself was under continuous strain. In contrast, the United States built its war industry with scale and integration in mind. Companies like Ford Motor Company didn't just manufacture products, they built systems. Massive, centralized facilities designed to handle every stage of production, from raw materials to final assembly. Supply chains were organized to support uninterrupted flow. Transportation networks, rail, road, and shipping, were coordinated to keep everything moving. And perhaps most importantly, the United States mainland was largely beyond the reach of enemy bombing. Factories operated without the constant threat of air raids. Production lines were not forced to stop and restart. Workers did not have to evacuate shelters and return to damaged facilities. The rhythm of manufacturing remained intact. This stability allowed something critical to happen: consistency. While German factories adapted to survive, American factories adapted to improve. Processes were refined, output increased, and efficiency steadily grew over time. The system was not just maintained, it was optimized. For the German prisoners, this difference was difficult to ignore. They had been trained to think in terms of tactics, strategy, battlefield movement. But here, far from the front lines, was another kind of battlefield, one defined by factories, supply chains, and production schedules. A battlefield where the outcome was measured not in territory, but in output. And on that battlefield, the balance was becoming clear. The scale of American industry, the integration of its systems, and the protection of its infrastructure created an advantage that was difficult to counter. Even the most advanced strategies could be undermined if they could not be supported by sustained production. For the men who had walked through Willow Run, this realization did not come all at once. It built slowly, piece by piece, just like the aircraft they had watched moving down the line. But by the time they left, the conclusion was becoming unavoidable. This was not a temporary advantage. It was structural. And it suggested that the outcome of the war might be shaped not only by battles fought in the air and on the ground, but something far less visible and far more decisive: the ability to keep building.
By the time the tour was coming to an end, something had changed. The same men who had entered with quiet skepticism, some even with a sense of confidence, were now walking more slowly, speaking less, observing more. The energy had shifted. What had begun as curiosity was turning into something heavier: understanding. Not all of them reacted the same way. Some tried to maintain composure, holding on to the belief that what they had seen was exceptional, perhaps even staged. Others remained outwardly calm, careful not to reveal too much in front of their captors. But the silence between them said more than words could, because what they had witnessed inside Willow Run plant was not something easily explained away. It was too large, too organized, too consistent to be dismissed as propaganda. It was real. And more importantly, it forced them to reconsider something fundamental. Up to that point, many German officers had believed that victory, or at least survival, depended on strategy, leadership, and battlefield execution. Industrial capacity mattered, of course, but it was often seen as just one factor among many. Now that assumption was beginning to crack, because what they had seen suggested a different kind of reality, one where production itself could shape the outcome of the war. As they replayed the images in their minds, certain details stood out: the endless line, the steady movement, the absence of disruption, the sheer number of workers, each contributing to a system that never seemed to slow down, and above all, the rhythm. One aircraft completed, then another, then another. Not as isolated achievements, but as part of a continuous flow. The B-24 Liberator was no longer just a machine to them. It had become a symbol of capacity, of organization, of a kind of power that did not rely on a single moment of brilliance, but on sustained effort over time. Some of the officers reportedly discussed what they had seen after the visit, trying to make sense of it. They compared it to their own experiences in Germany, to the factories they knew, to the limitations they had already begun to feel as the war progressed. The contrast was difficult to ignore. In Germany, production was increasingly under pressure, disrupted, constrained, forced to adapt under constant threat. Here, in the United States, production seemed almost untouched, expanding rather than shrinking, improving rather than struggling. It raised a question that none of them could comfortably answer. If this level of output continued, if bombers could be produced in such numbers, with such consistency, how could it be countered? Fighter interceptions could shoot some down, anti-aircraft defenses could destroy others, but those were tactical responses to a strategic problem. Because for every aircraft lost, another would take its place, and then another, and then another. The realization was not dramatic. It did not arrive with sudden panic or open fear. It settled in quietly, like a weight that could not be removed. For professional soldiers, trained to assess strength and weakness, it was impossible to ignore what they had seen. This was strength. Not just in machines, but in systems. Not just in numbers, but in the ability to sustain those numbers over time. As they left the factory, the scale of it remained in their minds, the length of the building, the movement of the line, the sense that what they had witnessed was only a small part of something much larger. Because beyond Willow Run, there were other factories, other production lines, other systems working in parallel, all contributing to the same objective: war on an industrial scale. And for the first time, some of them began to see the conflict in a different light, not just a series of battles to be won or lost, but as a contest of endurance, of which side could continue longer, produce more, adapt faster. In that kind of contest, the outcome was not decided in a single moment. It was built over time, just like the bombers they had watched moving down the line. By the end of the visit, the conversations had grown quieter. The earlier skepticism had faded, replaced by a more measured, more serious tone. There was no need to say everything out loud. The evidence had already spoken. And while none of them could predict exactly how the war would end, the direction was becoming harder to deny. Because what they had seen inside that factory was not just a display of industrial power. It was a glimpse of the future. A future where the ability to produce consistently, efficiently, and at scale could determine the fate of nations. And once that realization took hold, it did not leave them. It stayed with them long after they walked out of the factory doors, long after the sound of the assembly line faded behind them. A quiet, undeniable conclusion. Some wars are decided on the battlefield. Others are decided long before that, on the factory floor.